Imagine the stillness of a medieval night. The fire has burned low in the hearth. The heavy wooden shutters are drawn against the cold, and a family lies huddled together beneath rough woolen blankets. Darkness presses against the thatched roof. Silence reigns over the fields, and the world seems locked in slumber. Yet, at the heart of this silence, something unusual stirs. After only a few hours of rest, people across villages, towns, and even monasteries begin to wake. Not all at once, but in a rhythm that was strangely universal. For them, the night was not a single block of sleep. It was divided into two parts, a first sleep and a second sleep. This custom, so natural and so common to medieval Europeans, now seems bizarre to our modern eyes. Today, we are told that healthy sleep means one uninterrupted stretch of 7 or 8 hours. But in the Middle Ages, no one expected that. People slipped into sleep soon after nightfall, awoke around midnight for an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, then returned to bed until dawn. This strange pattern of biphasic sleep was not the exception. It was the norm. It is a rhythm that modern science only recently rediscovered, yet medieval men and women embraced it without question. They spoke of their first sleep as casually as we speak of bedtime, and their second sleep as naturally as breakfast. Historians have found countless references in diaries, medical texts, and even legal records, all pointing to this curious division of the night. A peasant in France might rise after his first sleep to stoke the fire or check on the animals. A monk in England might leave his cot to chant midnight prayers. A nobleman, lying awake by candlelight, might read a psalm, whisper to his wife, or write letters. The midnight hour was alive, not with noise and bustle, but with a gentle, almost sacred stillness. The reasons behind this two-part sleep are not mysterious when we consider the world of the Middle Ages. Without electricity or gas lamps, the setting of the sun defined the rhythm of life. Once the last glow of twilight faded, there was little reason to remain awake. Families retired early, their bodies guided by natural circadian rhythms. After several hours, the first phase of sleep came to its natural end. And so they woke, not restless or troubled, but calm, alert and expectant, ready to use this interval in the middle of the night. This period of wakefulness between sleeps was filled with quiet activities. Some prayed, believing the midnight hour was a time when the soul was closest to God. Others used it for intimacy, conversations, or tending to small tasks. Farmers might check on livestock. Mothers might nurse infants. It was not unusual to step outside, to breathe the crisp night air, or share a word with a neighbor whose hearth still glowed. In a way, this midnight waking was as much a part of life as the morning sunrise. And yet, for all its ordinariness then, it feels extraordinary now. Why did it vanish? Why do we modern people know nothing of it? The story of biphasic sleep is one of cultural change, of how firelight, candlelight, and eventually street lamps and electric bulbs reshaped our relationship with the night. But in this first glimpse, let us stand at the doorway of a medieval home and watch. A man stretches, rubbing his eyes after his first sleep. A woman murmurs a prayer. The children stir. The family talks softly in the dark before lying down again for the second sleep. This forgotten rhythm of the night is a window into a world where darkness shaped human lives as deeply as daylight. It is a reminder that what we call natural today is only one way of being, and that in the Middle Ages, night was not a single, unbroken dream, but a story told in 2 acts. To understand why medieval people divided their nights into 2 distinct sleeps, we must first step into their world, a world ruled not by the clock, but by the sun, the moon, and the steady turning of the seasons. Life in the Middle Ages was tethered to natural rhythms in a way we can scarcely imagine today. Artificial light was scarce, costly, and feeble. Once the sun set, people had little choice but to surrender to the darkness. Candles made from beeswax were expensive luxuries reserved for churches and the wealthy, while tallow candles or oil lamps burned foul and smoky, filling homes with an unpleasant stench. For the common folk, the fire on the hearth was their main source of light. It was warm, comforting, but dim and fleeting. As a result, nightfall came early. Families, exhausted from the day's toil in the fields or workshops, retired soon after dusk. They lay down on straw pallets or shared wooden frames stuffed with hay, cloaked in rough blankets or furs. In this world, there were no glowing screens to keep them awake, no electric lamps to stretch the hours. Sleep came quickly, and the first phase of slumber lasted 3 to 4 hours, carrying them into the heart of the night. But the human body is not simply designed for a single, unbroken stretch of sleep. Research has shown that, left without artificial light, our circadian rhythms naturally lean toward segmented rest. When modern volunteers have been deprived of electricity and allowed only candlelight, they too began to sleep in 2 phases, falling asleep soon after dark, waking in the middle of the night, and drifting back for a second sleep until dawn. In a sense, the people of the Middle Ages were living in perfect harmony with their biology. The midnight waking was not seen as a disorder, but as a gift. It was a natural pause, an interval when the mind was alert yet calm, and the body rested but not yet finished with sleep. Physicians of the period even wrote about it. Medical texts from the 15th and 16th centuries advised that waking between the first and second sleep was healthy, allowing digestion to settle before returning to slumber. This wakeful period was often called the watch, and was treated as an accepted part of the night. It is also worth noting how much labor shaped this rhythm. A peasant's day was long and grueling, stretching from sunrise to sunset. Resting early after dusk gave them precious hours of recovery before waking for a brief time in the night. Then came the second sleep, carrying them refreshed into the next day. The wealthy, too, embraced the divided night, but their midnight waking might involve reading by candlelight, writing letters, or even visiting neighbors. Monks in monasteries saw it as an opportunity to pray. The famous vigils or matins, prayers sung in the middle of the night, were aligned perfectly with this natural waking period. We must also consider the environment. Winters were long, and nights could stretch for 15 hours or more in northern Europe. Sleeping all the way through was neither practical nor necessary. Dividing the night into 2 phases allowed people to adapt to the sheer length of darkness. Rather than lie restless, they turned this interval into a useful, even sacred, part of life. The reasons for biphasic sleep, then, were a mixture of necessity, biology, and culture. With no technology to fight against the night, people leaned into its rhythm. Their bodies followed the cues of darkness and silence, while their customs and faith gave meaning to the hours between sleeps. To them, it was not strange. It was simply the way of things. In this simple act of rising and sleeping again, we glimpse a society in harmony with nature's clock, a people who accepted the night not as an obstacle, but as a partner in the dance of life. What we call strange today was once as ordinary as the sunrise. The first sleep of the medieval night began not with the striking of a clock, but with the rhythm of twilight. As the last glow of the sun sank behind the horizon, daily life wound down swiftly. Farmers finished their work in the fields, craftsmen laid aside their tools, and mothers tended the final embers of the cooking fire. Darkness came quickly in a world without street lamps, and once the hearth's light was all that remained, families prepared for bed. The act of going to sleep was itself communal. In peasant homes, a single bed might be shared by parents, children, and sometimes even servants or guests. Privacy was rare, and warmth was a necessity. In towns, apprentices and journeymen often slept in the same quarters as their masters. Even nobles, though they had larger chambers, shared beds with spouses, siblings, or attendants. Sleep was less an individual affair than a collective retreat, a survival strategy against cold and loneliness. The first sleep usually began only a couple of hours after sunset. In winter, this meant people were already asleep by early evening, long before we today might even think of resting. Their bodies, exhausted from labor, slipped into slumber with remarkable ease. The sounds of a medieval village fell silent. Only the distant barking of dogs, the soft creak of timber beams, or the whisper of wind through thatch marked the hours. What was this first sleep like? Accounts suggest it was deep and heavy, a plunge into restorative rest after the day's toil. Families drifted into dreams while the fire burned low, offering flickers of warmth and light. Scholars of the period noted that digestion was best aided by sleeping soon after supper, and indeed, the body seemed to follow this natural rhythm. The first sleep carried people through the darkest hours of the night, often until around midnight, when the cycle naturally shifted. Not everyone, however, lay quietly. Servants sometimes rose from their pallets to tend the fire, ensuring it did not die completely. Soldiers on watch in castles and walled towns guarded the gates, their torches glowing faintly against the blackness. Monks in monasteries often slept lightly, for the call to midnight prayer could interrupt the first sleep, pulling them from their cots into the echoing stone halls of the cloister. The universality of this first sleep is confirmed by countless references in literature and records. Medieval people spoke casually of their first sleep, as if it needed no explanation. Legal testimonies even describe crimes committed between the first and second sleeps, showing just how ordinary the concept was. It was as natural to them as talking about morning or evening. In this stage of the night, dreams also played their role. Physicians of the time believed that the first sleep was when the body purged excess humors, while the second sleep was more fertile for vivid, prophetic dreams. A man might wake at midnight to reflect on a troubling vision or to whisper it to his wife, convinced it held meaning for his fate. Yet for all its mystery, the first sleep was not remarkable to those who lived it. It was simply the expected rhythm of existence. After several hours, the body reached a point of natural wakefulness. People stirred, sat up, and quietly began the in-between hours. The first act of the night had ended, and the interlude, the time of midnight wakefulness, was about to begin. When the heavy silence of midnight descended, something unusual stirred across medieval Europe. Beds creaked as men and women awoke from their first sleep, rubbing their eyes, stretching stiff limbs, and slipping into a gentle wakefulness. Unlike today, this was not a sign of insomnia or troubled rest. It was expected, even welcomed. For an hour, sometimes two, households moved quietly in the shadows, embracing what they called the watch. The atmosphere of these waking hours was profoundly different from the bustle of daytime. The darkness was thick, broken only by the orange glow of a fading hearth, the flicker of a candle, or the silver wash of moonlight through a shutter. It was a time of hushed voices and soft footsteps, an interval where the world seemed paused between two halves of night. In this stillness, people found space for tasks, reflection, and even intimacy. For many, the first instinct was prayer. Manuals of devotion recommended this midnight rising as an ideal moment to speak with God, when the mind was clear and distractions few. Monks had institutionalized this rhythm. The bell would toll for matins, calling them to the chapel to chant psalms in haunting tones that echoed through cold stone halls. But ordinary villagers, too, might kneel beside their beds, whispering petitions for health, harvest, or forgiveness. The very silence of the hour gave their prayers a sense of greater weight. Others used the time for practical tasks. A farmer might rise to check on the animals, ensuring pigs, cows, or chickens were safe from predators. A woman might stir the fire to keep the coals alive until morning, or mend a piece of clothing by lamplight. Some took the chance to prepare food for the day ahead, kneading dough to rise before dawn. In towns, bakers and brewers sometimes began their work at these hours, their ovens and vats blazing while the rest of the world slumbered. Yet the midnight watch was not all duty. It was also a time of intimacy and conversation. Spouses often found this interval ideal for closeness, both physical and emotional. Without children awake or chores demanding attention, couples could share whispered words or affection in the privacy of the dark. Friends and neighbors, too, might quietly visit one another. Records from the period mention people borrowing tools, sharing news, or even conducting small gatherings during these midnight hours. Literature of the Middle Ages offers hints of how this time was perceived. In Chaucer's tales and in French romances, characters speak casually of the first sleep and the waking that followed, treating it as ordinary as we might treat breakfast. Medical texts advised that waking in the middle of the night was good for digestion, a natural pause before resuming rest. To wake between sleeps was not seen as odd. It was the expected course of the night. There was also something liminal, almost mystical, about the watch. Folklore suggested the hours between midnight and dawn were times when spirits roamed and the veil between worlds was thin. Some feared venturing outdoors, lest they encounter wandering souls, witches, or the devil himself. Others believed this period was ripe for visions and dreams, a sacred threshold when heaven or hell might whisper to mortals. And yet for most people, the watch was simply life. Children might stir and chatter before falling back asleep. Mothers might nurse infants. Fathers might sharpen tools or quietly plan tomorrow's work. It was an accepted rhythm. Sleep, wake, sleep again. The silence was not unsettling, but comforting, a pause between acts in the drama of the night. By the time an hour or two had passed, yawns returned, the fire was banked again, and families slipped back beneath their blankets. The second sleep awaited, carrying them toward morning. But those brief hours of wakefulness had left their mark, a time of prayer, work, love, or quiet thought, woven seamlessly into the fabric of medieval life. As the embers of the hearth glowed faintly and yawns spread through the room, the watch slowly came to its end. Families who had risen for prayer, chores, or conversation returned once more to their beds. This was the beginning of the second sleep, a phase of rest that carried people from the middle of the night until the first light of dawn. Unlike the heavy restorative slumber of the first sleep, this second stretch was lighter, filled with vivid dreams, subtle awareness, and a gentler descent into rest. Contemporary physicians believed this second sleep had a special quality. Medical texts described how digestion had settled during the watch, making the body more at ease and the mind freer to wander. As a result, dreams during the second sleep were thought to be more meaningful. Indeed, dream interpretation manuals from the late Middle Ages advised readers to pay attention to visions that came after midnight, for these were often considered prophetic, shaped by divine or cosmic influence, rather than by indigestion or earthly worries. Accounts from ordinary people reflect this belief. Letters and court testimonies sometimes mention conversations about dreams that had occurred during the second sleep, as if it were common to wake with stories fresh in mind. A farmer might describe a dream that foretold a coming storm. A mother might recall a vision of a lost child. Whether interpreted as omens, warnings, or blessings, dreams gave shape to the mystery of the second half of the night. This part of sleep also carried a different kind of atmosphere. If the first sleep was about recovering from labor, the second was more reflective, even spiritual. Monks who prayed during the watch sometimes returned to their cots with a sense of peace, drifting into their second sleep as though blessed. Couples, having shared intimacy or whispered secrets in the darkness, sank into rest with warmth and connection. The second sleep was quieter, softer, as though the soul had exhaled after the labors of both day and night. But the second sleep was not only about dreams, it was also practical. Waking early with the dawn was essential in a world where every hour of daylight mattered. The second sleep allowed families to rest just enough before beginning another day of hard labor. Farmers, for instance, often rose at first light to tend animals or prepare for the fields. Artisans stirred to light their forges, bakers prepared bread, and merchants packed goods for the market. The second sleep ended naturally with the arrival of morning tasks, as if the body itself knew when to awaken. Evidence of this pattern appears in the language of the time. Writers from Chaucer to court clerks used the phrase second sleep without explanation, assuming their readers understood. Legal records describe crimes happening after the first sleep, showing that everyone knew when that was. To medieval people, sleep was not a single, solid block. It was a story told in two acts, with a pause in between. What made the second sleep so different from the first was its position between two worlds. It lay between darkness and dawn, between the mystery of night and the demands of day. In those hours, people's thoughts could drift, their spirits could wander, and their dreams might carry them across boundaries of the ordinary. It was, in many ways, a liminal state, a gentle landing from the strange wakefulness of midnight back into the routine of life. By the time the first rays of sun streaked through shutters or touched the towers of churches, the second sleep came to its natural close. Children stirred, roosters crowed, bells rang for morning prayers, and life began anew. But behind this return to daylight was the hidden rhythm of the night, the strange and forgotten dance of two sleeps that guided medieval lives for centuries. If the idea of biphasic sleep sounds strange to us today, to medieval Europeans it was so ordinary that they scarcely thought to explain it. And yet, the fragments they left behind, in diaries, medical treatises, religious texts, and even court testimonies, reveal a pattern that is impossible to ignore. The concept of a first sleep and a second sleep appears again and again across centuries, scattered throughout the written record like a trail of breadcrumbs pointing to a forgotten truth. One of the earliest and most striking references comes from the 15th century physician Laurent Joubert, who described how people commonly woke after their premier sommeil before returning to bed. He even noted that this was considered healthy, allowing the body to digest food properly before resuming rest. Medieval doctors, steeped in the humoral theory of medicine, saw the break between sleeps as a natural division of the night, an interval in which the body restored balance before surrendering again to dreams. In England, the historian Roger E. Kirch has uncovered dozens of references in literature and court records that speak of first sleep and second sleep, as if they needed no explanation. A 17th century diary, for instance, mentions a man who, after his first sleep, rose to smoke a pipe and then returned to bed, Legal documents tell of crimes committed after the first sleep, so specific in their language that one wonders how judges and juries would have understood the timing if such a rhythm were not universally known. Religious writings provide further evidence. Monastic rules across Europe, from the Benedictines to the Cistercians, scheduled midnight prayers that neatly aligned with the interval between sleeps. Matins, the great night office, was not an interruption of normal rest, but a sanctification of it, timed to coincide with a waking that came naturally to the body. Monks did not so much fight against their circadian rhythms as embrace them, shaping devotion around the flow of human sleep. Even literature of the age is sprinkled with casual references. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, characters are depicted rising in the middle of the night. In French romances, lovers meet between the first and second sleeps. These mentions are never framed as oddities. They appear simply as a reflection of reality, the way an author today might describe a character waking for a midnight snack without needing to justify it. Medical texts from the Renaissance continued to describe biphasic sleep well into the 16th century. Physicians gave advice on what to do between sleeps, prayer, reading, or even light labor. Some warned against overindulgence in food or drink during the interval, fearing it might disrupt the second sleep. Others even suggested that couples use this time for intimacy, believing the body was more rested and receptive after the first phase of rest. What makes this evidence so compelling is its sheer consistency. Across countries, languages, and centuries, the pattern emerges. The watch between sleeps was mentioned in Italy, France, England, and beyond. It transcended class divisions. Peasants, nobles, monks, and merchants all experienced the same rhythm, though they used the time in different ways. In court records, in sermons, in poetry, the language of first and second sleep flows like an undercurrent, invisible until we know to look for it. And then, just as suddenly as it appears, the language begins to fade. By the 18th and 19th centuries, references to biphasic sleep become rarer. As cities grew brighter and schedules stricter, the memory of divided nights began to slip away. But the evidence remains. Buried in parchments, illuminated manuscripts, and fragile pages, waiting for us to notice the strange, forgotten custom of a world shaped by darkness. It is this chorus of voices, physicians, poets, priests, and peasants, that confirms biphasic sleep was not a quirk or accident. It was the heartbeat of the medieval night, as real and vital as the tolling of church bells at dawn. The rhythm of first and second sleep united medieval people in a way few other customs did, yet the way they experienced it varied greatly depending on class, wealth, and vocation. The basic pattern, sleep, wake, sleep again, was nearly universal. But how those wakeful hours were spent could reveal everything about one's place in the social hierarchy. For peasants, who formed the vast majority of the population, sleep was a communal act of survival. A family of 6 or 7 might share a single bed, or at least a pallet of straw and blankets, huddling together for warmth. Their homes were small and drafty, often little more than one smoky room where humans and animals coexisted. After a grueling day of labor in the fields, their first sleep came swiftly, heavy as stone. When they stirred at midnight, it was often to tend the fire, check on livestock, or soothe a crying infant. Sometimes neighbors called softly through thin walls or open doors, sharing words in the dark before returning to their rest. For peasants, the midnight watch was practical, woven into the duties of survival. The urban poor, crowded into towns and cities, lived similarly. Apprentices and servants shared quarters, lying side by side on benches or mats. Their wakeful interval might be spent completing tasks for their masters or whispering gossip in hushed tones. In cramped conditions, privacy was rare. The waking hours between sleeps sometimes offered the only quiet moment for personal thought. But even in towns, the expectation of 2 sleeps held true, so common that city bells often rang not just at dawn, but at midnight, marking the natural division of the night. Nobles and the wealthy, by contrast, experienced the midnight interval with greater freedom. Their beds were larger, their chambers warmed by multiple hearths, and their lives less shackled by sheer exhaustion. For them, the hours between sleeps might be a time for writing letters, reading manuscripts by candlelight, or conversing intimately with their spouses. Wealthy households often employed guards or servants who also stirred during the watch, tending fires or patrolling the halls. The rich could afford beeswax candles that burned bright and steady, turning the night into a gentler realm for contemplation or luxury. Clergy and monks occupied a unique position. For them, biphasic sleep was not just a natural rhythm, but a spiritual duty. Monastic life was governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, which demanded prayer at fixed intervals throughout the day and night. Midnight matins or vigils aligned perfectly with the break between first and second sleep. When the bell tolled, monks rose from their cots, filing silently into the chapel to chant psalms in the flickering light of oil lamps. Their return to bed afterward was seamless, as though their rest and their worship were 2 halves of the same cycle. In this way, religion did not resist the body's rhythms, but sanctified them, transforming ordinary sleep into a pattern of devotion. Women, too, experienced the divided night in distinct ways. For mothers, the midnight waking was often dominated by nursing infants or soothing children. Manuals of household advice even recommended that women use this quiet time for tasks such as spinning, mending clothes, or preparing food for the morning. Yet the interval could also provide a rare moment of agency. In some households, women used the stillness to whisper prayers, share secrets, or plan family affairs with their husbands. Interestingly, the biphasic rhythm also leveled society in subtle ways. While the rich and poor used their wakeful hours differently, all shared the same pattern of sleeping twice. A nobleman with a candle might read poetry while a peasant stirred the fire, yet both recognized the same midnight pause. In a world where class dictated almost every aspect of life, the divided night was a common thread, binding castle and cottage alike to the same rhythm of darkness. In the quiet of those hours, society revealed itself. Laborers tended chores, nobles indulged in leisure, monks lifted prayers to heaven. And when the interval ended, all returned to their beds, surrendering once more to the second sleep that would carry them toward dawn. The medieval night was not only divided by biology, it was infused with meaning. The interval between first and second sleep was more than a simple pause. It was a threshold, a liminal moment when the ordinary world seemed to loosen its grip, and the spiritual, the cultural, and the supernatural crept closer. In the quiet of midnight, people did not just tend fires or whisper to their spouses. They touched something beyond themselves. Religion framed much of this meaning. To the Christian mind of the Middle Ages, night was a time when the soul was tested, when temptation whispered, but also when prayer was most potent. Monastic communities structured their lives around this belief. The ringing of bells for matins at midnight or the early hours of morning sanctified the natural waking that split the night. For monks, rising to chant psalms in the cold darkness was both duty and blessing, aligning their spiritual devotion with the body's own rhythms. Ordinary layfolk, too, often prayed during the midnight watch, believing it a time when heaven was listening more closely. when angels moved more freely between earth and sky. But not all associations were holy. Folklore cast midnight as an hour of danger when spirits roamed and the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Villagers told stories of witches who prowled at this time, of fairies who lured wanderers into the woods, or of restless souls haunting crossroads. Some feared stepping outside during the interval, lest they meet forces too powerful for mortal defenses. In a world lit only by moon and stars, shadows took on a life of their own, and imagination filled the gaps left by ignorance and fear. Yet there was also intimacy in these hours. Couples often found the midnight watch to be the best time for closeness. Without the press of daily labor or the presence of others, they could share private words, tenderness, or physical intimacy. Manuals of health even recommended intercourse between first and second sleeps, suggesting the body was rested yet not sluggish, primed for fertility. In this way, the night carried not only spiritual weight, but generational consequence. Children were likely conceived during these liminal hours. Cultural gatherings sometimes grew from the watch as well. In villages, neighbors might call softly across yards or visit briefly, carrying embers from one hearth to another. These encounters reinforced bonds of trust and kinship. The midnight hour became a space for community in miniature, a pause in which the boundaries of houses thinned and people connected in hushed tones. Dreams, too, held cultural meaning. Many believed that dreams from the second sleep were clearer and more prophetic than those of the first. This notion seeped into literature, where visions and omens often appeared in the quiet between sleeps. Dream books circulated, offering guidance on how to interpret what one had seen in the night. Was a dream of fire a warning of lust or of divine inspiration? Was a vision of water a sign of danger or renewal? To medieval people, these questions were not idle curiosity. They were attempts to read the language of God and fate written across the canvas of the night. The midnight watch thus carried layers of symbolism. It was a time when ordinary life and spiritual yearning met, when fear of the unseen mixed with hope for divine contact. It was at once sacred and dangerous, intimate and communal. To modern eyes, it may seem a simple interruption in sleep, but to medieval hearts, it was an interval charged with power, mystery, and meaning. When people finally lay down again for their second sleep, they did not simply return to rest. They carried with them the weight of prayers spoken, fears confronted, dreams remembered, and bonds deepened. The watch was not wasted time. It was a hidden treasure of the night, a gift as essential to the medieval soul as daylight was to the body. For centuries, the rhythm of first and second sleep seemed eternal, as natural to Europeans as sunrise and sunset. Yet by the dawn of the modern age, the language of divided nights began to fade from records. By the 18th century, references to first sleep and second sleep were dwindling, and by the 19th, they were nearly forgotten. What had been an unquestioned norm for generations slipped silently into obscurity. Why? The answer lies in light, industry, and the reshaping of human time. The first blow came with the slow conquest of darkness. In the Middle Ages, night was absolute. People relied on starlight, moonlight, or the faint glow of hearths and candles. Darkness governed life, dictating early bedtimes and segmented rest. But as technology advanced, artificial light grew more abundant. In wealthy households, beeswax candles gave steady, bright flames. By the 17th century, oil lamps improved, and public lighting began to appear in European cities. Paris was among the first to illuminate its streets with lanterns, transforming the way citizens experienced the night. Where once the world had surrendered to darkness, people could now linger in taverns, walk safely through markets, or read and write long after sunset. The second blow was social. As towns expanded and literacy grew, leisure at night became more attractive. Coffeehouses and salons, flourishing in the 17th and 18th centuries, turned the late evening into a time for conversation, debate, and creativity. Writers, musicians, and thinkers increasingly used the night to work. What had once been hours reserved for the watch or the second sleep became hours of culture, pleasure, and productivity. Midnight was no longer a quiet threshold, but a lively frontier. Then came the greatest shift of all, the Industrial Revolution. Factories demanded rigid schedules, standardized hours, and labor that began at dawn. Urban workers no longer had the luxury of lingering between sleeps. They needed rest consolidated into one long stretch to prepare for grueling shifts. The rise of mechanical clocks, railroads, and timetables reinforced this new discipline. Time itself was industrialized, chopped into precise hours and minutes that left little room for the organic rhythms of medieval life. Artificial lighting and industry combined to crush the old pattern. With gas lamps and later electric bulbs, darkness was no longer an obstacle. Cities glowed at midnight as brightly as they did at noon. Families delayed their bedtimes, staying awake longer into the evening. Instead of retiring soon after sunset, they might read, sew, or socialize under steady light. This pushed the first sleep later and later until it merged seamlessly with the second. The pause between them disappeared. Medical thinking also shifted. In the 19th century, physicians began to describe uninterrupted sleep as healthier, labeling fragmented sleep as a disorder rather than a norm. With new scientific ideas about hygiene, efficiency, and discipline, biphasic rest came to seem primitive, even backward. What had once been a universal custom was redefined as insomnia. And so, by the modern era, the memory of first and second sleep was gone. People spoke instead of a good night's sleep, meaning a single unbroken block of rest. The interval between sleeps, once filled with prayer, dreams, and quiet reflection, was erased, replaced by the steady glow of lamps, the demands of industry, and the hum of modern life. Yet the disappearance was not complete. In rural communities, especially where artificial light remained scarce, biphasic sleep lingered longer. Farmers and villagers in isolated corners of Europe and beyond continued to rise in the night well into the 19th century. But as modernity spread, their rhythms, too, were absorbed into the single sleep culture that dominates today. The strange irony is that science now suggests segmented sleep may be more natural than our rigid modern habits. Left in darkness, human bodies often revert to the pattern of two sleeps. The medieval world, shaped by necessity rather than knowledge, had stumbled upon a rhythm we carry still within our biology. But history swept it away, leaving us to wonder what we lost in the conquest of the night. Though the language of first sleep and second sleep faded from memory, the pattern itself has never truly disappeared. Beneath the surface of modern life, in the quiet of our bodies, the ancient rhythm lingers. Science has shown that when humans are freed from the demands of artificial light and industrial schedules, they often slip naturally back into the medieval pattern. In this way, our ancestors' strange nights whisper to us still. Experiments in the late 20th century proved this vividly. When volunteers were deprived of artificial light and left in extended darkness, their sleep divided spontaneously. After a period of adjustment, they began to sleep for 4 hours, wake quietly for 1 or 2, then fall into another 4-hour rest. What medieval people took for granted, modern science rediscovered. biphasic sleep lies hardwired in human biology. It is not an oddity of the past, but a rhythm written into our very flesh. Even today, many experience it without realizing. Insomniacs who wake in the middle of the night and fret about their rest are, in truth, echoing a natural pattern. Those who wake around 2 or 3 a.m., lie awake in thought, and then drift back to sleep are closer to medieval peasants and monks than to modern sleepers. The problem is not their body. It is the mismatch between biology and cultural expectation. Some cultures never abandoned biphasic rhythms entirely. In parts of southern Europe and Latin America, the siesta persists, a daytime echo of the divided night. While not the same as the medieval watch, it reflects a similar truth. Human beings are not always meant to sleep in a single, unbroken block. Even modern cities that never sleep, with their bustling late-night diners and midnight workers, resemble the medieval world's acceptance of the night as a living, active time. There is also a revival of interest in segmented sleep as a path to health. Some sleep researchers argue that waking gently in the middle of the night could reduce anxiety, offering time for reflection, meditation, or creativity. Historical evidence shows that many of the great minds of the past, poets, philosophers, and monks, used those hours not as a burden, but as a gift. In our overstimulated age, reclaiming that quiet watch might feel like a return to something lost. The memory of first and second sleep lingers, too, in literature and folklore. Phrases buried in old diaries and plays still puzzle readers until they learn of the forgotten rhythm. Shakespeare's characters sometimes speak of the first sleep, and court records reveal witnesses describing events that happened between sleeps. These fragments are like fossils, evidence of a world where time was marked not by clocks, but by the turning of the body. Modern life, of course, is unlikely to return to biphasic nights on a wide scale. Electric light, work schedules, and global culture push us toward the long, unbroken sleep we now consider normal. But individuals can, and do, choose differently. Writers rising at midnight to work, parents awake with infants, and dreamers lying quietly in the dark are all, in their way, heirs of the medieval watch. Perhaps this is the final lesson, that what we call strange in the past was, in truth, profoundly human. The medieval world accepted the body's natural rhythm without shame. They prayed, loved, dreamed, and whispered in the night. What we now treat as a problem, waking in the dark, they embraced as an opportunity. In their world, sleep was not a prison of unconsciousness, but a dance with the night, a dialogue between body, soul, and time itself. And so, though we live in a world of glowing screens and buzzing alarms, the two sleeps of our ancestors are not gone. They lie within us, waiting, like embers beneath ash, ready to flare again if the world ever darkens enough for us to remember.